Salve my friends, welcome to this week's episode of the Imperium blog. Although it has been a couple of weeks, this week's episode is going to be brought to you by Evil Twin Alan. The real Alan has actually been transported to some ear infection ravaged land where he is not coming back, and I'm going to take over for the next week or two. No, I actually decided to try this out because I used to sport one of these many years ago, and I thought I'd try it, and I do like the little snow touches as years pass on. Gives me a kind of odd look, perhaps a distinguished look, you tell me. But I'd just like to welcome you to this week's episode. This is episode 5, which is going to be talking about development and I suppose what you could call evolution of the story. Because as those of you who've paid attention may know, the actual Imperium cycle bit has gone through many stages of evolution throughout its time in existence. It was originally created when I was 13 years old, which is 32 years ago in November. Oh my god. And I invented it when I was still at school. I wrote it during free periods on the school computers, and they very nicely let me print it out. I actually have in my parents' basement somewhere an actual spiral bound manuscript of the original, which was then known as the very imaginatively titled Bloodstar, and could probably be a Warhammer 40k fanfic. I didn't know about Warhammer 40k then. I learned about it later. It was actually writing that Bloodstar series that actually drew me towards Warhammer 40k when I saw the models. But we live and learn, don't we? And as you know, that caused me to abandon the series until about 5 years ago. I picked it back up again, and it has now developed and evolved into what it is today. And as you know, it went through several series. It went through the Hegemony series, which was interesting, though the title needed a bit of change. And from bouncing things off the wall with my good friend Laurie Golding, I came up with an alternative title, as he suggested that perhaps hegemony in this day and age is used in a little bit of a, a certain ascendance of monochrome kind of belief, if you understand me. But one must not be afraid to let their work evolve. One of the main arguments and discussions I see going around writing groups and forums at the moment is that of the pantser versus the plotter. Now, in my opinion, this is a simplistic division of the writing world, because we all plot, otherwise we wouldn't have a story. We all come up with the idea and at least the basic structure of what the story is going to be, who the characters are going to be, and where that is going to lead us with a story. We have to, because if we don't, then we're just going to have a disordered mess of a story which is going to lead us nowhere. Think about that for a moment. I am more of what would be called a pantser, as it were, though I don't see myself as that. I see it as I allow impulsiveness and inspiration to drive me along sometimes. And in the terms of Imperium, that has been very useful, because things that have developed along the way may appear at times to be completely impulsive creations or complete pantser creations, but things that you've seen developing recently, models and ideas and storylines and characters, and even things like the races that exist, I hinted about them very, very early on. The goblins, people say, where did you get the goblins from? They weren't even mentioned in the original stories. Oh yes, they were, but not as overtly as people would like to mention. There is one line in one of the original short stories in the collections that hints at the goblins, and that is where Sham says those strange little what did he say? I don't trust the midgets, and those strange little boil guys even less. And people didn't pick up on that. The Lupanikis corrected him and said they're dwarves. It was a funny line of dialogue, really. What was it? It was Sham said, "I don't trust them midgets, and those little bald guys even less." Automatically, he was corrected by Kaliadis, who said, "Dwarves." And Sham said, "Well, dwarves, midgets, what's the difference?" And Kaliadis absolutely finished with, "Dwarves have beards." It was kind of funny. But anyway, Sham did hint at the existence of the goblins, and one thing that I've included in the development of the goblin race is a line in their new biography, in the encyclopedia, is that you only see them if they want you to see them. They're very stealthy and very sneaky individuals. So Sham caught a bare impression of them because he's very observant. And he was aware that they were bald, but he didn't mention them emphatically as small, skinny, green bald creatures. And not all of them are bald, incidentally. Some of them have hair, as you may have noticed from some of the artwork. As you've seen, Dr. Shone has hair, but a lot of them choose to shave it off because that's just what they like, or some of them are really old and they lose it. Look at our good singing friend who's gone sort of for a little wide centre parting, as it were. He's just got a little bit of hair around the edges. Goblins do have hair, but they choose not to always cultivate it. It's the ones who are more artistic or more exploratory, but goblin fashion tends to go towards boldness. Now, okay, as I developed the Gorkai, I did add that connection that Gorkai and goblins appear to be somewhat related, though how could they be when goblins are clearly native to the earth and Gorkai have never been here, so it is believed. But I leave that there. You may have noticed I do enjoy leaving loose ends floating around. The idea of the ancients, the idea of the goblins and the Gorkai, the idea of who the saddle who helped Sham is, of what unity is, or was. All those things I leave hanging loose because I want to perhaps develop those later as I'm working through the series, but I want to leave the little hook there already to have already made people wonder. And when I get to it, as things develop, as I impulsively change them, I don't have to go back and retcon things because I left the question floating there already. And that, my friends, is one of the most difficult things, and what I describe as being the argument against the pantser versus plotter division of writers. Because as I've said, I like to invent and innovate things as I'm going along, come up with things and let things go their own way sometimes. But I have left the narrative structure there to accommodate those changes when they come, if that makes sense to you. So in effect, I'm a plotter and a pantser in one, and something quite entirely different. Now, if you look at it, I have had to go back and retcon a few things. I've done it with the Imperium series several times, especially the collections and the novellas are going through that process. That's why it's taking so long. I'm working on storylines that will turn up in the novellas, which are still in some kind of flux of development at the moment. So I'm waiting until I've actually I suppose I couldn't think of the word there, determine that storyline correctly. So I don't release those books and have to pull them down again because I've got to change something. That does no good for my reputation. As huge and influential as it is, yes, I got retweeted by William Shatner. Yes, I've been retweeted by a couple of famous authors. Yes, Stephen King thought I was funny. But I have achieved not fame just yet. Twitter is not the world. It is not. And yes, I've got a few people who like my videos, and I'm not as big as I would like to be, but we're getting there, aren't we? We all are. We are all building our fandom, and the thing, and well, I'll come back to that later. Let's stay on point, shall we? I'll try and stay a little more coherent and cohesive than I normally do, to see if more people will pay attention and not lose interest 5 minutes in. What I'm trying to say is, you can plot out your bare bones of your story. You can build the skeleton, you can draw the basic map, you can present the picture, and you can fill in the details later. It's one of the things that I've had, and I'm proud of, that several influential people, who I shall not name, have looked at my art and looked at it and actually said, I've zoomed in on that, and the amount of details, the level of the number of things in there is shocking. It's an incredibly detailed piece of work. Thank you. You know who you are. I do that intentionally because, in a way, we all, as you know, we all see the story in our head, we all see the scenes in our head, we all see what we want to write in our head. For me, creating an artwork of key scenes and key characters and their surroundings and things going on around them is a way of giving structure and, I suppose, some degree of permanence to those visions inside of my head. Some of the set piece action artworks that I've drawn have helped me write those scenes later, and will help me write those scenes later, as I can describe. An example I will use, two of them I will use. The first one is the assault on Tamesis, which is a council flotilla of some degree pursuing what appears to be an Imperium loyalist fleet of Harpy, a squadron of Harpy fighters, and basically appearing to pretty much annihilate them. In that scene you have Union soldiers crossing London Bridge, you have the various carriers and patrol vehicles attacking, you have tanks deploying, but in the background you have some Stymphalian carriers and some Griffon carriers coming through the cloud cover to actually bomb the bejesus out of them, because it was a trap all along. And that scene is going to be quite interesting in the book when it actually comes, when Imperium forces and the Panastas, or the Resistance, actually finally join forces and turn the tide against the Union, which is going to happen. Alexander is going to stand back, perhaps, and be very little involved. He's going to say, as you saw in the second piece of art that I'm going to mention, when the Dragon's Crown and the entire Imperium Kalshadar fleet returns to Earth orbit, which is, the amount of detail in that is incredible. There must be about 50 Harpy fighters deployed. There's several wings of Stymphalian, a wing of Griffons, and all kinds of pyrotechnic chaos going on around the orbit of the Earth. But that is important. That's a dividing, spreading out show of force. What we haven't shown yet is, on the other side of the Earth orbit there is going to be the Union spaceships. That's going to be a huge space battle, and I wanted to measure out, to visualize and to show the deployment of the Kalshadar orbital military forces. That once they've destroyed the orbital defences, it's going to force the Council to the Union, or the Council, to show their hand and deploy their own space forces, which no one has seen yet. That's quite intentional. I haven't created art on those because I have them visualised, but I want their appearance in the book to be a very big surprise. Everyone's anticipating the Council's or the Union's military forces are somewhat crude when compared to the Imperial ones, and to some degree they are, but they're not non-existent. And we have more recently hinted at those in the art piece which introduced the Gorkai more fully to the public eye, when the Gorkai are raiding a Union ship. And those of you who look around can see that ship appears to be, shall we say, a little bit more technically advanced in some regards than the artwork we've seen in the Imperium ships. When we've seen that piece of artwork with an epibatoi patrolling in an Imperium ship, and several others. Now, one has to think, if the look of the interior of the Union ship that's being assaulted is in some way superior to the Imperium ships that are returning, because don't forget the Imperium ships were all built 1,000 years ago, close enough. So even though they were advanced when they were built, are they still advanced now? What we have to think about is, what if that is the interior of a Union ship, what is the exterior going to look like? And that's going to be quite interesting. And as you can see, that's what I'm talking about. I appear to be coming up with things as I go along, but I have an actual plot, an actual structure, an actual idea of where it's going already in here and already committed in the bones of the story. And to me, that's an important thing to do as a writer. You need to have both the rigidity of your actual story plan, the original A to B to C to D, etc. But within that matrix, if you see it as a three-dimensional matrix of points, within that matrix there's a lot of empty space. And that empty space has to be filled. You know, if you want to use, let's say, a physics metaphor, you have what we know is visible matter in the galaxy, in the universe, etc. And according to physicists of today, a lot of that empty space between them is filled with what's called dark matter, which is completely undetectable, and by any means we possess, we can only detect it by its effects. So too goes with these innovations and inspirations and impulsive parts I add to the story. Their influence can be seen from what is laid out, but we have to fill them in. We have to fill the space between the actual structure, the bones, the scaffolding of the story, to make it a whole entire rather than an empty shell. And this, I say to you, my fellow writers, is a danger as a new writer to do. If you too strictly, too rigidly plot, your story, in my opinion, is going to lack some of the dynamicity that the works of what we should, I suppose, call more experienced writers will have. You know, I use a lot of examples. You know, you see a lot of my favoured writings of people such as Graham McNeill, Terry Pratchett, David Zindel, Dan Simmons, and several others. I see now when I'm reading their works that there is a lot of in there which I like to call improvisation or writing, where it seems like they had an idea, they laid it out, and then as they were writing, I thought, what about if that happens? And the thing is that's genius is that they left their clues, their hooks, their barbs 10 chapters behind. And then when it comes to it, with those hints they had laid earlier still in their mind, they come up with something completely unexpected. And that is because as the story developed, as the dynamics, as everything that drove the story went forward, what they originally thought out when they planned it had changed by the events that had took place as they were arriving at that point. And so that's what I say, if you rigidly plan and you get to the point where a reveal is coming, you stand a very strong chance of writing an incredibly terrible cliche. Because let's say as you're writing and trundling through, you will see how things develop, how characters develop. If you wrote something that character is going to do as they were at the beginning of the story, then if you've written it well, they are not going to be the same when they arrive 10 chapters, 15 chapters into the story. They are going to have changed. The famous character development is going to have taken place. Therefore, a decision, for example, I would have made 10 years ago is not a decision I would make today. Or even a decision I would have made 5 years ago is not a decision I would have made today. Because in those 5 years, I've married my wife, I have lived in different countries, I've experienced different things, and I've become a father. And now, my priorities, my goals in life, my level of taking risk have changed. So the Alan of 5 years ago would not make the same decisions the Alan of now would make. Just as, for example, in the stories, one character who's going to go through a lot of development in Imperium is going to be Ollie, Sean Olimore, the hoplite of the Imperial army. He starts out as a terrible soldier, as a bit of a wimp, as a bit of a, to excuse upon a bit of a spineless individual, and he's going to change through the story. That's why I like to present him here and there. The original plan that Sean Olimore would have followed is not going to be the plan he follows as we come to the end of the first book. He's not going to be the same person. The same with many of my characters. I presented them in a way that shows their dynamicity, their change. If you look at the picture of Sean Olimore in the full uniform as an Imperium hoplite soldier, look at his eyes and the set of his features. Don't look at the fact that he's long-faced and skinny and long-limbed and a bit on the ugly side with a big nose. That's the exterior. What's happening in the interior, just like with real people, is more important. Look at how hard his eyes are. Look at his stiff posture. Look at the determined set of his jaw and his features. In there is a man who's going to go places and do things. And another example, look at the picture of the Epibatoi Sergeant Gwydion. In there you see a man who, look at his eyes. I spend a lot of time on the eyes and the set of the features of any characters I draw. Because to me, and hopefully to anyone who looks at them, that gives you an idea of their character. Kaliadis is barely suppressing a laugh in his picture, even though he's holding two swords and looking rather martial. There's that twinkle in his eye and that twitch in his mouth. Neshar is staring off into the distance, as he always does. You can even see Korai, even though he's swiping a bloody massive axe, there's a chuckle on his face, if you pay attention. And all of my characters, all of my artwork, all of my designs are filled with detail, and most of it's there for me. That as I work on the artwork of that character, I develop the character as I go along, and I seriously recommend that to my fellow writers. If you're in a rut, if you're in a struggle, even if you feel your art is not good enough to share with the world at large, do it anyway, even if it's a rotten, scribbly mess that looks like one of my daughters drew it. First and foremost, the art you're creating is going to be for you to develop ideas. I used to find, using this as a pure example, when I was going through difficult times, had difficult decisions to make and couldn't decide what to do. Excuse me. I journaled. As in, at the end of the day, before I went to sleep, I would write that day down, step by step, everything that had happened. And I found that in writing it down in a somewhat ordered fashion, I saw the problems I had faced that day and stressed about and got upset about and got some of these grey hairs from made a lot more sense, and my decision was easier to make. And it was actually a damn stupid, easy decision. Same applies in your writing, my friends. Think about it. If you take your idea of a character, you take your idea of what they're going to look like, how their equipment is going to be, how their clothing, their appearance, their posture, their expressions are going to be, and then you represent that in an artistic form. You take the basic shape, their face, especially their eyes. In my opinion, eyes are literally the windows of the soul, but the set of their features, facial hair if they're of a male appearance, if they want it, any additions that they have. One of my absolute favourite pieces of art to look back on and go over is Parksy. They are so full of tiny little details that are going to tell you so much about them as a being, as a person. From their eyes to the augmetics on their feet, on their face, to their little tiny scars they've got on their head, to the gloves and everything they have on their hands, to their clothing, tells a story about that individual, and it helps me refine and streamline how I'm going to describe that character, because I look at that piece of art and I describe Paxi perfectly. I had the idea of Paxi very early on, but once I did artwork on them, I could now describe them. In fact, the moniker of spider being that Paxi likes to go by came from the artwork. When I looked at the artwork and realised how long and elongated and, I suppose, Slendermanish they looked, that obviously led me to believe that they were a Gila from the moon, just like Sean Ollymore is. Sean Ollymore, when I was drawing him, I couldn't find a way to compress the proportions, and then the logical thing came to me. Someone who's born and raised on the moon, with the moon's natural gravity, is not going to have the same gravitational pressures upon the development of their body, so it's natural that they will be, as Gwydion likes to call them, bird-boned, as in they're going to have longer, less dense bones. And so working on that early way to show Sean's character, and we will come to it, Paxi's, is the fact that they had to, in order to operate successfully on the Earth with gravity 3 times stronger than they have ever experienced, they had to go through some very arduous training activity to strengthen their muscles, their bones, and even their connective tissues, because just falling over on the Earth for a Gila would have disastrous consequences. It would be like a racehorse. They would fall over and shatter bones, tear muscles, because their body is not used to the great crushing weight of Earth gravity. And it's little details like this that you have to think about. And in drawing your art and thinking of ways to explain the tiny little details, that is how you develop. It's how you see potential plot holes and pitfalls and tears in the fabric of your work before somebody else does. And that's why I like using my artwork to do that. And that's just a small example of some of the things that making artwork, pouring your character's soul onto a screen or a page, how much that can help. Because I'm talking about all of my characters. Some of my characters I started off early where they were just what we would call stick figures and straw people. They were effectively an idea or a concept sketched out loosely. And let's say the literary description of them was less than adequate. This is when I was a true novice and hadn't gone through the challenging fires of developing myself as a writer, which I have to add is something that is an unending process, by the way. Nobody, not even Stephen King, would describe himself as a perfect writer. Stephen King, I believe, from what I've heard, is still learning. So are we all. Even Neil Gaiman is still learning, regardless of the fact that he's been writing for years and is doing rather well for himself. So I hear. But, excuse me, this beard still itches. I've grown this in a week. Effectively, I'm one of these people who grows facial hair very, very quickly. A week ago, I sketched it out in what little hair I had from 2 days' growth, and then over the course of the week, I've grown it in and trimmed it up a bit. But there you go. Unrelated entirely. And my girls think it's funny that it tickles when I give them a kiss. They love it. They actually want more kisses now because they love being tickled. But there you go. But let me see. Where was I going? Oh yes. We are always evolving as writers, and we have to allow ourselves to evolve. And the artwork that I started to do when I first started drawing artwork of Imperium characters, and as you know, I started initially with the artwork of the Chronicles of Enoch characters. As I developed that, as I gained more skill, as I gained more confidence, as I learned new techniques for creating my digital art, excuse me, I'm sorry, I was able to instill and develop more of the essence of my character into that art, and the character themselves as I wrote them became more detailed and involved. Now look at it this way, as my artwork evolved for that character, so too did the character themselves, as I was able to instill more traits, more expression, more idiosyncrasies, more details, more aspects of their appearance and little trinkets that they wear upon their clothing, little personalizations that they have upon their armor and their general appearance, scars, help me develop that character a little bit more. Even, gosh, their hairstyle or their posture tells you a lot. If you look at the example, the one that took a lot of work was the Gorkai captain on the raid and on the Union vessel. His posture as he stands back, head thrown back, arms thrown back, body thrown back as a kind of rah, celebrating his absolute victory. That tells you everything you need to know about the Gorkai. But if you see behind him, if you look at his equipment, they're not brutal, savage creatures as the orcs are represented in other aspects of fiction and science fiction. You see them operating behind in quite a disciplined, organised manner. And they're not whole-scale slaughterers, they're holding back and firing in order to slow any resistance down when, as you see with the Gorkai captain, there's a remains of somebody cut in half at his feet with their blood still running off of his sword. And that's where I'm going in to here. It's where I've been leading up towards with the development. I've had a conversation with several of my writing colleagues recently about the more recent artwork I've been drawing. It has been taking a decidedly darker tone. The Gorkai raid is blood everywhere. It's worse than a modern horror movie, honestly. There's blood all up the walls and all over him and on the floor and dripping off of his sword and everything. It's brutal. But war usually is. War is not pretty and flowery and everything like that. One thing I remember, there's been a lot of criticism about Oliver Stone's Alexander film with, what's his face, the Irish bloke, I can't remember, playing Alexander and all of the Macedonians having Irish accents, it was an interesting device, I have to be honest, which I'll let you study into rather than me describe it. But when Alexander came in from the Battle of Gaugamela, after having completely devastated no, it's not was it Xerxes? No, Xerxes was in 300, wasn't it? It was oh god, this is terrible. Me and Alexander Buff, I've forgotten. I'll come back on this because I'm actually embarrassed. You tell me. After defeating the army of the Persian king, whose name has escaped me briefly. This happens to me often. I forget words, I forget things I actually know, I forget my own name on occasion. It's terrible. It's age. It's getting to me. 45 this year, lots of grey hairs coming out, at least in my beard, and some around here. I want to remember it, so no. Anyway, I'll carry on rather than me sitting here looking perplexed and flummoxed for a while. It was Darius, wasn't it? Anyway, after Darius' army was destroyed and he fled into the far distance, Alexander comes into his tent victorious, covered from head to foot in blood and gore, which is how it would have been. He wouldn't have come in all pretty and shiny. Colin Farrell, that was who he was. He wouldn't have come in all pretty and shiny and lovely. He'd have been covered in dust and blood, some of it his own, some of it other people's. And that's the king, the leader. Even the Khal Shadar and the Dracograth, our grand heroes, won't come out of battle nice and clean. Especially as the Dracograth especially enjoy a doctrine of close combat as their dominant form. They don't really as you've seen, they don't really come equipped for ranged combat. They can use Khal Shadar weapons, they can use growlers and pistols and everything, and as you see, they all have pistols in their artwork. But they have their primary doctrine is that of close combat, so they're going to be covered from head to blooming foot, or from helmet to boot, as it were, because they're fully enclosed, obviously, when they're in full combat. As you have, if any of you who have read the last book of the collections, Neshar closes his helmet when he goes into close combat in order to protect his vulnerable flesh from any stray shots or cuts or anything. It's going to be the same thing. So, is it that I am taking a darker turn, or that I am choosing to show it? You tell me. The next piece of artwork that's going to come out I'm working on at the moment, the Tree of Pain. Thank you, Dan Simmons, for that inspiration, by the way. The Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons, if you haven't read them, I do seriously recommend giving it a go. Imagine the Canterbury Tales in the future with a lot of metaphysical and strange twists and a bit of John Keats and a bit of Shakespeare. You'll love it. Anyway, let me continue. So my artwork taking a darker turn, is it that I am taking a darker view in my writing, or that we are arriving to the development of a darker stage? Because let's be honest, anybody care to tell me how I've set up the first book of the Imperium cycle is going to be colourful and cheerful? We have what effectively could be called zombie Khal Shadar. We have a good chunk of the world under the rule of an authoritarian, religious, fanatic government, and we have a very repressed and hidden rebellious force looking desperately for support. We have at the same time those of you who have read Son of the Dragon, and the new version is coming out soon, don't worry. Son of the Dragon ends on a very, very dark and sombre note. The fifth book of the novellas, which directly precedes book one of the Imperium cycle. It was a very dark, horrible and sombre note, and the Tree of Pain artwork that's coming out is from the final, well, not the final scene is a little after that, but, well, no, because it has, the final pivotal scene preceding the aftermath and fade to credits part. It directly represents that, but in a slightly artistic fashion. I'm not going to change that final scene, but I can tell you how that final scene is represented in the artwork and how it is written in the book are somewhat different, and if you want to spot the differences and question my choices as to why, go ahead and read it when it comes back out. You're going to love it. But sometimes your art doesn't have to be a literal representation. You can use allegory and imagery in your artwork that is not necessarily literal, and I do that an awful lot. You have to think all forms of art basically embody real things in some sort of allegorical framework. Artwork, especially the Impressionist art, takes concepts and codifies them in a certain way and represents them in a certain way. My artwork, though, it's more photorealistic in its appearance, has a lot of allegorical content hidden in there for you to see, and that's just the way I do it. But my writing and the poetry from the collections also, the reason I put the poetry in the collections is because breaking up those little flashbacks, those little views, those little strobe light bursts of story with the poetry is that key concepts hidden within those stories resonate with the poetry that either precedes or follows it. And those of you who think I'm an impulsive writer will be shocked by the actual vast degree of planning that has gone into pieces coming. Sometimes it's pure flash of amazing inspiration that just happens to work out. Some of my artwork especially has just happened to go a certain way and I've run with it. Other times I've had to throw it in the bin, the metaphorical bin, and curse it and start again. It's just the way it goes, often with the writing. And I'm going to draw with a close here, but I'd like to finish up because I am rambling a little bit. So, as I've said, in conclusion, don't be afraid of your style. Don't be afraid of letting your style, your characters, your events, your story develop and evolve. Don't be afraid of letting a previously decided rigid structure alter. Don't be afraid, conversely, of keeping the bones solid and set, but altering the flesh that surrounds them, altering the void that surrounds them, changing the nature somewhat of the dark matter that swirls around them. Don't be afraid of letting inspiration strike you like a bolt from on high or a spark inside of your brain. Don't be afraid to use a more poetic turn of it, of the little bird in front of your window telling you a secret or two that makes you think differently. Be inspired by everything around you, everything you see, everything you hear, everything you observe, as well as everything you imagine, because that's what we as writers are. That's what separates us from those who do not write. We see, observe, and think on everything we see, and choose to both incorporate it into our writing and come up with explanations for it in the same. That is what we are. So weird is part of our job description. Don't be afraid of being weird. If you're not weird, you're not a good writer. So learn to, shall we say, cultivate your weirdness and make it something interesting. Because let's be honest, people who are going to be the biggest fans of your work, especially if you write sci-fi, they're going to be a little bit weird as well. So appeal to them with your own weirdness. And now, I will leave you, my friends, and thank you as ever, with this conclusion of episode 5 of the Imperium blog. You guys have a great and wonderful time between now and when I record the next video. I thank you, and I'll see you all soon. Love you all. Bye bye.